In the morning, a cheerful traveler in a fresh shirt climbed into the carriage. By evening, a creature in ice-crusted furs would crawl out, barely able to remember its own name. And ahead lay another 5 days of travel, with each night somehow requiring sleep in this moving freezer. Because without sleep, you simply wouldn't survive. The history of winter travel is a history of survival, with all its uncomfortable, freezing, and profoundly human details. Let's take a journey 200 years back in time. Picture a December evening in the Russian Empire or in Europe. Outside the window, a blizzard rages. The temperature has dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and you must travel. Not just a ride to the nearby village for bread, but an actual journey that could last a week or two. And you have no choice to postpone the trip until spring, because business will not wait. This is where things get truly interesting. For a modern person, it is difficult to imagine that winter was not an obstacle to travel, but on the contrary, the best time for long journeys. Paradoxical, is it not? Yet when you think about it, it all makes sense. In summer and autumn, roads turned into impassable mud. Carriages sank up to their axles. Horses were utterly exhausted. But in winter the ground froze solid. Roads became as hard as stone. Sleighs glided easily over snow and ice. Travel speed doubled. However, the catch was this. Travel speed increased, but comfort did not improve. Quite the opposite. Imagine yourself wrapped in layers of clothing, seated in a jolting carriage as the Siberian cold rages outside. And you are not simply sitting for a couple of hours, but for a day, a night, another day. You must sleep right there in this shaking icebox, because postal stations do not appear as frequently as one would wish. What motivated people to endure such hardship? There were countless reasons. Some were compelled by family events, a distant relative's wedding, a funeral, or the birth of an heir. Imagine a person receiving a letter. Your aunt is getting married. What to do? Not go, you would offend her for life. Go, and you will shiver from cold in a carriage for 3 days. Merchants and traders simply could not afford to wait for spring. Goods must move now, while prices are good, before competitors get ahead. And so they rattled along winter roads, calculating profits, while simultaneously trying not to freeze off something important. Officials traveled on government business, and here, certainly, no winter frost was considered a valid reason for refusal. Have an imperial decree? You will kindly travel even in -30-degree frost. And imperial couriers, these absolutely flew like madmen, changing horses at stations and barely managing to warm themselves with a gulp of hot tea. Romantic travelers also specifically selected winter for their journeys. They wrote enthusiastic notes about snow-covered landscapes, about how beautiful the frost was on the trees, how majestic the frozen rivers. True, in these same notes, between the lines, one could read complaints that fingers would not bend from the cold, and the ink in the traveling writing set had turned to ice. A special category, lovers who traveled to their sweethearts. Now there were people whom no frosts could stop. History records cases when young people covered hundreds of versts in bitter cold just to spend a few days with the object of their sighs. Romantic, certainly. Madness, also. Yes. Now let us envision the very picture of such a journey. Early winter morning, still dark. You approach your carriage, and the first thing you feel, icy air literally burns your lungs. The coachman is already bustling about with the horses. His beard is covered with frost. His breath turns into thick clouds of vapor. He helps you climb into the carriage, and here begins the true acquaintance with winter travel. Inside the carriage it is cold. No, not simply cold. It is a true glacier. Overnight the carriage stood in the frost and managed to freeze through completely. The leather seats are as hard as boards. The upholstery is frightening to touch with a bare hand. You will stick to it. Your breath turns into thick fog, and you understand. Here it is, your bedroom for the next day, or even longer. The initial hour of the journey is the most torturous. The body simply cannot warm up, despite all your furs and sheepskins. The carriage bounces at every unevenness, and the cold seems to penetrate into your very bones. Legs go numb, the back begins to ache, and there are still several hours of riding before the first station. And here you begin to understand. Romance is romance, but the reality of winter travel was a harsh test of endurance. The most intriguing aspect began with evening, as the journey continued past sunset. Carriages continued to rush along winter roads at night, and that meant one thing. You would have to sleep. Sleep in a carriage that shakes, creaks, leans on turns. Sleep in the cold, when even under a pile of blankets and furs you feel the frost creeping toward you. Visualize yourself trying to get comfortable on the hard seat, draping a travel blanket over yourself, pressing a hot water warmer to your chest. You wrap your head in a kerchief or scarf, because otherwise you will certainly freeze your ears. You shove your feet into a special fur bag and begin counting sheep, or versts, to the next station. Sleep in such a carriage was more like a series of brief episodes. You dozed off for a minute. The carriage bounced on a bump. You woke up. You dozed off again. The horses turned sharply, and you were thrown into a corner. You fell asleep again. And then you felt that your nose had completely frozen. You had to rebuild the entire construction of blankets. And there was also the risk of dropping the warmer, and then all pleasure ended entirely. Affluent travelers had access to larger, more spacious carriages that allowed for almost lying down. Yet even in the most luxurious carriage, sleeping in winter was still a challenge. The cold spared no one, neither nobles, nor merchants, nor simple travelers. The difference lay only in the quantity of furs, the quality of warmers, and the thickness of blankets. Interestingly, people adapted to it. Yes, the body adapted, and experienced travelers developed their own secrets of comfortable sleep in an icy carriage. They knew how to wrap themselves properly, in which position the body went numb least, how to arrange warmers for maximum effect. This was a true art of survival. Diaries of that time are full of entries about winter journeys. Some described them with humor. Woke up because my beard had frozen to the collar of my sheepskin coat. Others philosophized. On the road, a person learns the true value of a warm hearth and a soft bed. Still others simply stated facts. Rode all night, did not sleep, froze to death, but arrived on time. Interestingly, many travelers noted a strange effect. After several days in an icy carriage, a station overnight seemed like heavenly bliss, even if it was a simple peasant hut with hard bunks. A warm room, the possibility of lying down horizontally, the absence of shaking. What else does one need for happiness? My name is Daniel Hayes, and this is Lectures Under the Moon, where we uncover the forgotten details of how people lived, traveled, and survived in eras vastly different from our own. And so we approach the main question. How did people manage not simply to survive, but actually to sleep in these icy carriages? What strategies did they employ? What inventions arose? And most importantly, what does their experience reveal about our ancestors' resourcefulness and resilience? We will discuss this further when we look inside the winter carriage and learn all its secrets. So, you have decided on a winter journey. The first question that arises, what exactly will you travel in? Because your summer carriage, so elegant and light, in winter turns into a deadly trap. Thin walls, opening windows for ventilation, delicate upholstery. All of this works beautifully in July, but is utterly useless in January. A winter carriage is a separate story entirely. And indeed, this was a story that every carriage owner told in their own way, based on the thickness of their wallet and the degree of love for their own comfort. Wealthy nobles could afford to have separate winter carriages, specially constructed for the cold. Those who were poorer converted summer vehicles, insulating them with whatever materials were at hand. As for common folk, they made do with what they had, and were grateful if they managed to travel without frostbite. Let's begin with the aristocrats, because their vehicles were the pinnacle of engineering thought of that era. Imagine, if you will, a dormouse. This was a sort of sleeping carriage on wheels, a French word, by the way, from dormir, to sleep. The main function was already embedded in the name. The dormouse was built spacious, with the ability to unfold the seat into something resembling a bed. Inside it was upholstered not simply with fabric, but with a multi-layered construction. First felt, thick as 3 fingers, then a woolen lining, and only on top velvet or leather for beauty. The walls of the dormouse were made double. Between the outer and inner paneling, they stuffed everything that could retain heat. Most often straw, yes, ordinary straw, the kind used to feed horses. It was light, held air excellently, and, most importantly, accessible. Wealthy gentlemen added sheep's wool there, and particularly refined ones added eiderdown. The result was a kind of thermos on wheels, only a very imperfect one. Windows in winter carriages were a separate saga. In summer, glass panes were a luxury and a sign of wealth. In winter they became a problem, because cold penetrated through glass faster than through any upholstery. Therefore windows were made small, and from the inside they were covered with oil-soaked fabric or special shields made of that same felt. It got dark, but at least it was warmer. Light penetrated only through small cracks, and during the day an eternal twilight reigned in the carriage. But the most important thing in a winter carriage was the floor. It was through the floor that most of the heat escaped, because under your feet there was no barrier between you and the icy road. Here everyone managed as best they could. In the dormouse, you know, they laid thicker boards on the floor. On top, a bale of straw, then felt mats in several layers, and already on them, carpets. The result was something like a layered cake in which your feet were the filling. Doors were insulated just as carefully. Around the perimeter, they attached leather bolsters stuffed with horsehair. These prevented wind from penetrating through the cracks. From the inside on the door, they often hung an additional curtain of thick broadcloth or bearskin. Opening such a door was a whole adventure. It weighed as much as a modern refrigerator. Now let's move on to a more democratic variant, the vozok. This was no longer a carriage on wheels, but a sleigh with a body shaped somewhat like a carriage. The vozok was beloved in Russia because over snow it traveled lighter and faster. The runners glided smoothly, the shaking decreased, and sleeping became slightly more bearable. True, the vozok was lower than the carriage, closer to the snow, which meant colder. But it was easier to insulate by one's own efforts. The structure of the vozok was simpler than the dormouse. A wooden body on sleigh runners, inside benches along the walls, or one long seat. No springs, of course. These were sleighs, after all. Upholstery was poorer. Not velvet, but simple broadcloth. Instead of down, the same straw or oakum. But the principle was the same, to create an air layer between the traveller's body and the external cold. An interesting detail. The vozok was often made with a folding top. In summer it could be folded down and one could ride enjoying the views. In winter, the top was closed tight, additionally covered with koshma, thick felt made from camel or sheep wool. The result was a sort of awning that trapped the heat emanating from the passengers. Yes, indeed, in a cramped vozok packed with people, it could even be rather hot for the first half hour. Then it would start growing cold anyway. Even simpler was the kibitka. This was essentially an open sleigh with an arched top covered with fabric or felt. A merchant's variant for those who travelled often but didn't splurge on luxury. The kibitka was drafty from all sides, but at least it was spacious. One could carry goods, family, and everything necessary for a long journey. The kibitka was insulated minimally. The same felt over the frame, straw on the floor, and everything else was the responsibility of the passengers and the quantity of their sheepskin coats. Now, let's explore the most fascinating aspect: how they transformed an ordinary summer carriage into a winter one. This was a whole art, passed down from coachman to coachman. They began in autumn, as soon as the first snow fell. They removed the light summer upholstery, if there was any. All cracks were caulked with oakum mixed with tar. Such a mixture didn't let wind through and didn't freeze. Windows were closed with wooden shields, leaving one or two for light, and those were curtained from the inside. On the floor, they laid everything that was at hand: hay, straw, old rags, felt scraps. The main thing was to create a thick cushion between the feet and the bottom of the carriage. On top, they might lay a board or spread a bearskin. Those who had no bear made do with sheepskin or simple matting. Seats were wrapped with sheepskin coats or old fur coats, creating at least some semblance of softness. The outside of the carriage was also insulated. The body was hung with felt covers, special blankets of thick felt. These protected from the wind and created an additional insulating layer. The wheels were sometimes changed to runners, transforming the carriage into something between a sleigh and a vehicle. It turned out ungainly, but traveling over snow became easier. The wealthy didn't stop there. They ordered special fur bags for the feet, enormous ones made from bear or wolf pelts. You stuck your feet in such a bag and sat as if in felt boots the size of a barrel. They also made fur rugs. These were large mats of sheepskin with which people covered themselves. One rug was laid on the seat. The second was thrown over oneself like a blanket. Between the two rugs, a warm cocoon formed, in which one could survive even severe frost. Worth mentioning also is lighting. In a winter carriage, it was dark even during the day, and at night you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Using candles was dangerous. They could set the upholstery on fire or tip over from the jolting. Therefore, they used special traveling lanterns with thick glass and reliable mounting. But most often they did without light altogether. They slept, and that was that. Why light if you couldn't see anything anyway behind the felt curtains? The difference between the vehicles of the nobility and commoners was colossal. A count could travel in an insulated dormouse upholstered with sable, with double walls and warmers made of Chinese porcelain, while a peasant dragged along in ordinary dray sleighs, covered with a peasant coat and having placed under his backside an armful of hay. The result, generally speaking, was the same. Both froze, only the count froze more slowly and with greater comfort. Technical innovations appeared gradually. At the beginning of the 19th century, springs came into fashion. Springs that softened the jolting. For winter journeys, this was salvation, because the less you're shaken, the easier it is to fall asleep. True, springs made the carriage heavier, and it was harder for the horses, but the comfort was worth it. Another improvement was the pivoting front axle. Previously, carriages didn't handle turns well. They would skid on the slippery road. With a pivoting axle, it became easier to steer, and vehicles overturned less often. For winter, this was important. If you fell into a snowdrift, count on losing half a day to digging out and half the heat from the carriage. Imperial vehicles stood apart. There, they didn't stint on money at all. Double or even triple walls stuffed with swan down. Floors with heating. Yes, indeed. Under the seat, they installed special braziers with charcoal that smoldered slowly and warmed from below. Dangerous, certainly. Effective, quite so. The main thing was to make sure that carbon monoxide didn't enter the cabin. In Imperial carriages, there were even primitive ventilation systems, special tubes that expelled stale air outward and admitted fresh air, already slightly warmed, passing it through the warm walls. Ingenious for those times, definitely. A separate story was the postal carriages. They carried not only letters, but also passengers who paid for a seat. Postal carriages were made as light as possible, so that speed would be higher. Insulation there was minimal. Thin walls, simple upholstery, no luxuries. But they travelled fast, changing horses at stations every 20 to 30 versts. Passengers of postal carriages knew, either you freeze or you're late. There was no third option. Merchant carriages occupied the golden middle ground. Not as luxurious as noble carriages, but sturdier and more practical than postal ones. A merchant understood that the road would take more than one day, so everything had to be arranged wisely. That's why merchant vehicles were often equipped with special compartments for provisions, built right into the walls. They stored hardtack, dried meat, flasks of vodka for warming. Under the seats, they made compartments for valuable goods or money. Anything could happen on the road. Interestingly, many travelers noted that in severe frost, it was better to ride in a simple open sleigh than in a closed carriage. A paradox? Not at all. In an open sleigh, you could wrap yourself in a sheepskin coat, cover yourself with felt blankets, and create around your seat a dense cocoon of furs. But in a carriage, the air circulated, cold penetrated through the cracks, and no double walls could save you. Plus, in an open sleigh, you moved more, shifting things, adjusting your clothes, and movement is warmth. Another important point, the size of the vehicle. The larger the carriage, the harder it was to warm it with your own body heat. One person in an enormous dormouse froze faster than 3 people in a cramped open sleigh. That's why experienced travelers preferred to travel in company. It was both merrier and warmer. 3 or 4 people sitting close together under a shared felt blanket created a decent source of heat. There were also completely exotic variants, for example, transformer carriages that rode on wheels in summer and were simply placed on runners in winter. Convenient, practical, economical. True, such a design was less stable, and on turns the carriage could skid. But then you didn't need to keep 2 separate vehicles. To conclude, consider this thought. Whatever the carriage might be, luxurious or wretched, with double walls or simply upholstered with bast matting, they were all the same in the main thing. They were not simply means of transportation. They were testing chambers in which a person learned the limits of his endurance, and bedrooms on wheels where one had to learn the art of sleeping in unthinkable conditions. It is precisely this art that we will discuss further when we turn to the main thing, to the secrets of survival and warming in an icy carriage. Now, you're sitting in a frozen carriage, facing a night's journey ahead, with only your wits and what you brought to protect you from frostbite. Welcome to Survival School for the Winter Traveller of the 19th century. There will be no boring theory here, only proven methods for not turning into an icicle. We'll start with the primary tool against the cold: warmers. Don't think this is a modern invention. Our ancestors knew their business when it came to portable heat. The simplest and most accessible warmer is an ordinary brick. Yes, a building brick that was heated on the stove before departure. A brick is good because it holds heat for hours, 3, even 5, depending on its size and how thoroughly it was heated. The technology is simple to the point of genius. At a way station or at home, the brick was placed right in the stove, in the embers. While the horses were being harnessed, the brick absorbed the temperature. Then it was pulled out with tongs, wrapped in several layers of rags or an old sheepskin coat, and placed in the carriage under your feet. For the first 20 minutes or so, it was terrifying to touch such a brick even through the wrapping. But then it turned into an ideal source of heat. It didn't burn, but it warmed reliably. Seasoned travelers carried 2 bricks. While one warmed, the second cooled. At the next station, the cooled one was exchanged for a newly heated one, and the cycle repeated. It turned out to be something like an infinite source of heat, if, of course, the stations came frequently enough. The only problem was weight. 2 bricks meant about 7 kilograms of extra load. But cold is a convincing thing, and no one complained about the weight. A more refined option: metal warmers. They were made of copper or tin in the form of flat boxes or cylinders with screw-on lids. Boiling water was poured inside, the lid screwed tight, and you had a personal heating battery. Such warmers were lighter than bricks and more convenient to handle. They could be pressed to the belly, placed under the back, or shoved into a fur bag for the feet. The disadvantage of metal warmers was that they cooled faster than brick. After 2 or 3 hours, the water in them became barely warm, and you either had to endure or wait for the next station. But such warmers served for years, were passed down as heirlooms, and were considered a valuable item in road equipment. The most advanced travelers of the 19th century got as far as chemical warmers. These were special pouches with powder that, upon contact with air, began to oxidize and release heat. Chemistry, sir! True, such warmers cost insane amounts of money and were accessible only to very wealthy people. An ordinary merchant made do with a brick and didn't worry about it. Another popular method of warming up: hot coals. At postal stations, they kept special cast iron or iron boxes with lids and air holes. These boxes were filled with red-hot coals, closed, and placed in the carriage. The coals smoldered slowly, releasing steady heat for hours. The main thing was not to close the box completely so the coals wouldn't suffocate, but not to open it too wide either, so smoke wouldn't pour out and open burning wouldn't start. The danger of such warmers was obvious: carbon monoxide. That's why they were placed as low as possible, under the feet, where the air circulated less, and the windows, or special ventilation openings, were kept slightly ajar, even if brutal frost reigned outside. Better to freeze a little than to be poisoned to hell. There were cases when travelers fell asleep with closed windows and smoldering coals, and never woke up again. That's why coal warmers were treated with respect and caution. Now let's move on to clothing, because no warmer will save you if you're dressed incorrectly. Winter travel clothing is a separate science. The main principle: layering. Not one thick fur coat, but several layers of different clothing, between which air pockets form. Air is the best thermal insulator. This was known long before the appearance of modern insulation materials. It started with undergarments. In winter, they wore a thick woolen or linen shirt, long underpants. On top, another, simpler shirt. Then a vest or waistcoat. Over that, a kaftan or frock coat. And only after that, a fur coat or sheepskin coat. It came out to 5 or 6 layers on the torso. Moving in such gear was uncomfortable, but the heat was preserved perfectly. Legs were insulated no less carefully. Woolen stockings, and often not 1 pair, but 2. On top, cloth or leather trousers. On the feet, felt boots or fur-lined boots. And in the carriage, the legs were shoved into a special fur bag, enormous, made of sheepskin or bearskin. You climbed into such a bag up to the waist and sat as if in a sleeping bag. The cold couldn't get to your legs, and after all, it was the legs that froze first and foremost. Hands were hidden in a muff, a fur cylinder into which both hands were shoved at once. Inside the muff, they often kept a small warmer, so your hands stayed warm, and the warmer was close at hand. Gloves were also worn, but in the carriage they were usually removed. A muff was more convenient. On the head, a fur hat that covered the ears and the back of the neck. The face was wrapped with a scarf so that only the eyes remained visible outside. Breathing through the scarf was unpleasant. It became damp from breath and began to be covered with frost. But there was no choice. A separate category, fur blankets. These were huge rugs of sheepskin or other furs with which people covered themselves in the carriage. One blanket was laid on the seat, a second was thrown over yourself from above, like a bedspread. Between the two blankets a warm capsule formed, in which you could survive even severe frost. Wealthy people traveled with blankets of sable, bear, wolf. Ordinary folk made do with sheepskin, but the principle remained the same. An interesting trick. Down-traveling quilts. They were sewn from dense fabric, quilted, and stuffed with goose or swan down. The result was a light but incredibly warm quilt, under which you could sleep even in a frozen-through carriage. Such quilts cost dearly, but served for decades, and were considered an obligatory attribute of long journeys. They didn't forget hot drinks either. For the road, they took special traveling samovars, small ones with thick walls that held heat for a long time. In the morning, boiling water was poured into the samovar, and until midday, the tea remained hot. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. Even more popular were thick-walled clay jugs in woven cases stuffed with straw. Such a jug filled with hot spitten or mulled wine could keep warm for an astonishingly long time. Spitten, that's a whole separate story in itself. A hot honey drink with spices, drunk in freezing weather for warmth. It contained honey, water, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. Sometimes herbs were added. They brewed it strong, sweet, and scalding hot. One glass of such spitten warmed you from within so thoroughly that for about 20 minutes you couldn't feel the cold at all. That's why at every station, the first thing travelers asked for wasn't soup, but spitten. A stronger warming option was vodka with pepper or cognac. A shot or two genuinely created a sensation of warmth. True, doctors of that era already knew that alcohol dilates blood vessels, causing heat to leave the body faster. But who listened to doctors when you were freezing to death? The main thing was not to overdo it, because a drunk traveler could fall asleep in an awkward position and wake up with frostbite. Hot food also helped preserve warmth. For the road, people took everything that could keep for a long time and provide plenty of energy. Lard, smoked meat, dried bread, nuts, dried fruits. Calories are fuel for the body's internal furnace. The more you eat, the more heat is released during digestion. That's why on winter journeys, people ate frequently and heartily, not counting portions. Another trick was movement. Sitting still for long periods meant freezing. Experienced travelers would periodically stretch right inside the carriage, wiggling their toes, rotating their feet, tensing and relaxing muscles. Some would even stand up and do a few squats or bends as far as the ceiling height allowed. It looked ridiculous, but it got the blood flowing and warmth returned. At stations, they would climb out of the carriage and move actively, jumping, waving their arms, squatting, running around the vehicle. Local residents were accustomed to the sight of frozen travelers hopping around the yard like possessed souls. 10 to 15 minutes of such exercise, and you could set off again. The psychological factor also played a role. A solitary traveler felt the cold more intensely than someone in company. When traveling with one or two companions, you could chat, tell stories, distract yourself from the cold. Plus, the warmth of several human bodies in an enclosed space genuinely raised the temperature by a few degrees. 3 people under a common fur covering. That was almost comfort by the standards of winter travel. There were also quite exotic methods, for instance, warmers filled with quicklime. Lime in contact with water releases a great deal of heat. People would take a box of lime, sprinkle it with water, and get a hot warmer for several hours. True, the fumes were caustic, and breathing near such a warmer was harmful. But desperation drove people to anything. Or, here's another method: living warmers. Some travelers took dogs along to warm them with their body heat. A small dog would be placed under the furs by their feet, and it would lie there, radiating warmth. The dog was warmer under the furs too, so it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. There are known cases of people even taking piglets. They're warm too, and will sit quietly if you feed them. The most important rule of all: don't fall into genuinely deep sleep in severe frost. In sleep, control over the body is lost, circulation slows down, and the risk of frostbite increases many times over. So people tried to doze in snatches, periodically waking to check whether their feet had frozen, whether the warmer had cooled down. This wasn't proper rest, but rather a series of brief lapses between periods of wakefulness. That was the arsenal of weapons against the cold. From simple bricks to ingenious multi-layered constructions of furs and sheepskin coats. Each traveler, over time, developed their own system, combining different methods. And you know what's most astonishing? It worked. People survived, reached their destinations, and even managed to sleep in these icy carriages. About how exactly they slept, what positions they assumed, and how they dozed off to the clatter of hooves, we'll tell you next. All the warmers are in place. You're wrapped in 3 sheepskin coats. A fur sack embraces your legs, and ahead lies a long night of jolting over ruts. Now the main question: how exactly do you fall asleep in all this? Because sleep in a carriage isn't simply a matter of closing your eyes and switching off. It's an entire science, with its own rules, tricks, and secrets that were passed down from experienced travelers to novices. Let's start with the most obvious thing. Space for sleeping was catastrophically scarce. An ordinary carriage didn't accommodate horizontal positioning. You sit on a hard bench, back pressed against the wall, legs against the opposite seat or on the floor. Forget stretching out full length. The most you could hope for was a semi-reclining position at about a 45-degree angle. And in this pose, you needed to spend 8 to 10, sometimes even 12 hours until the next station. The most widespread sleeping position in a carriage was popularly called the sitting corpse. You settle deep onto the bench, lean your back into the corner of the carriage where the rear and side walls meet. You either tuck your legs under yourself or stretch them diagonally if there's enough room. You throw your head back, resting it against the wall through a pillow or rolled-up coat. You cross your arms on your chest or hide them in a muff and freeze in this position, praying that the carriage won't hit a bump hard enough to wrench your neck. The problem with this pose was the neck. It would grow so numb that in the morning you couldn't turn your head. So experienced travelers made special travel pillows in the shape of a horseshoe that wrapped around the neck and supported the head. Such pillows were stuffed with buckwheat hulls, goose down, or that same sheep's wool. The result was a primitive but effective head brace. The second popular variant was the curled hedgehog position. This was chosen by those traveling alone who could occupy the entire bench. They'd lie on their side, drawing their knees to their chest, placing their head on a rolled-up coat or belongings. In this position, you could even sleep relatively comfortably, provided, of course, your height allowed you to fit on the bench. Tall people had to bend themselves so much that straightening out in the morning was quite an adventure. In dormice, those very luxurious sleeping carriages, the situation was somewhat better. There, the seats unfolded, transforming into something like a narrow bed. The length of this bed was about 2 meters, sufficient for most people. True, the width left much to be desired, 60 centimeters, 70 at most. Turning from side to side was risky. You could simply fall onto the floor, so people mainly slept on their backs, tightly wrapped in furs so as not to slide around with the jolting. Wealthy travelers took along special traveling mattresses, thin mattresses stuffed with horsehair or straw. They'd spread these on the unfolded seat, lay a thinner featherbed on top, cover it with a sheet, and it became almost a real sleeping place. Of course, everything still shook, and every bump was felt through the whole body, but it was heaven and earth compared to a bare wooden bench. A special mark of elegance: travel sheets. Yes, in the carriage they changed the bedding. Wealthy nobles carried stacks of linen sheets and pillowcases with them. At every station where they stopped for the night, a servant would change the linens for fresh ones. Soiled ones were folded into a special bag and later sent to the laundry. To us, this sounds absurd. Changing sheets in a jolting carriage in the middle of winter. But for aristocrats of the 19th century, this was a matter of hygiene and status. Common folk, however, did without such luxuries. In freight wagons and covered carts, they'd lay an armful of hay or straw on the bottom. On top, they'd spread burlap or an old coat and sleep away to your heart's content. The straw quickly compressed, turning into a hard lump, but at least it was slightly softer than bare boards. Besides, straw provided additional insulation from below, and that was more important than any comfort. An interesting technique was group sleeping. When several people rode in a carriage, they arranged themselves to use space as efficiently as possible and share warmth. The most common arrangement: 2 sit at the edges of the bench, leaning into the corners of the carriage, while a third lies between them, resting their head on one person's knees and throwing their legs over the other's knees. Uncomfortable as anything. But warm, and there's room for everyone. Another method was soldier stacking. All passengers would lie down on their side in the same direction, like spoons in a drawer, pressed tightly against one another. The first person leaned their back against the wall of the carriage, the second pressed against them from the front, the third against the second, and so on. The result was a compact construction of human bodies in which each person warmed their neighbor and received warmth in return. After a couple of hours, when one's side grew numb, the entire construction would flip over to the other side on command. It required coordination, but it worked. The psychological techniques for falling asleep in a carriage were no less important than the physical positions. The hardest part was accepting the inevitability of discomfort. Newcomers to long-distance travel wouldn't sleep at all during the first nights. They would toss and turn, complain, grumble. Experienced travelers had long since made their peace with it. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's cold. Yes, it's bumpy. But there's no other option, so relax and try to get at least a little rest. The monotony of movement helped. The steady swaying of the carriage, the clip-clop of hooves, the creak of runners or wheels, all of this created a lulling background. The brain gradually grew accustomed to the rhythm, stopped perceiving it as an irritant, and drowsiness would set in. Not deep sleep, of course, but a kind of half-slumber, when consciousness floats between waking and dreaming. But even that was better than complete wakefulness. Some travelers used breathing techniques, a deep, slow breath in through the nose, holding the breath for a few seconds, a smooth exhale through the mouth. Repeat 20 to 30 times, and the body would calm down, muscles would relax, sleepiness would come. Of course, no one called these breathing practices. Experienced people simply noticed that it made falling asleep easier and passed the knowledge along. Visualization also helped. You'd close your eyes and imagine a warm place, a home hearth, a bathhouse, a summer afternoon in a hayloft. You'd mentally transport yourself there. Imagine the warmth on your skin, the smells, the sounds. The brain is partially deceived, and the cold doesn't feel quite so sharp. Monks and wanderers could meditate this way for hours, barely noticing the conditions around them. Ordinary people didn't always have such powers of concentration, but it was worth trying. Alcohol was used cautiously. A small dose, a shot of vodka or a sip of cognac, really did relax you and help you fall asleep, but too much led to the opposite effect. A drunk person would relax too much, assume an uncomfortable position, and wake up in the morning with numb limbs, or, worse still, with frostbite. So the golden rule of road alcohol was just a little bit for warmth and falling asleep, but no more. Warm milk with spices was a folk sleeping draught. At stations, people would ask for milk to be heated and add honey, cinnamon, nutmeg to it. Such a drink both warmed you and helped you relax. Milk contains tryptophan, an amino acid that promotes the production of melatonin, the sleep hormone. Of course, our ancestors knew nothing about tryptophan and melatonin, but they noticed the effect and used it. An important point: the sleep regime on the road differed from the usual one. At home, people were used to sleeping in one unbroken block, usually from sunset to dawn. In a carriage, that wasn't possible. Sleep was fragmented into short segments. You'd doze for an hour or an hour and a half, wake from a violent jolt, adjust your clothing, fall asleep again for 40 minutes, wake again. Over the course of a night, there would be 4 or 5 such cycles. In total, maybe 6 or 7 hours of sleep, but not consecutively. Interestingly, experienced travelers considered such fragmented sleep even more useful than ordinary sleep. You manage to get some rest, they'd say, and you're always alert enough to notice if something goes wrong. Modern research, incidentally, shows that polyphasic sleep can be quite effective. Our ancestors discovered this through empirical means, simply because there was no other way out. Before sleeping, they'd conduct a small ritual, checking all the warmers and insulation. Brick in place and still warm? Excellent. Fur bag on the feet tightly secured? Good. Felt blanket arranged so it won't slip off? Perfect. This ritual created a sense of control over the situation and was calming. When you know you've done everything possible for comfort, it's easier to relax and fall asleep. Morning in the carriage began not with roosters or sunrise, but with the warmers finally cooling completely, and the cold beginning to creep through all the layers of protection. People would wake with the sensation of wooden limbs, a stiff back, and absolute certainty that they would never, ever get into a winter carriage again. This certainty would last until the next journey, when it would all repeat anew. Stretching after waking was mandatory. Fingers and toes were worked first. Blood had to return to the extremities. Then the neck, careful turns of the head from side to side. Then shoulders, back. If space allowed, people would stand up and do a few bends and squats right in the carriage. It looked comical, but it helped restore mobility to the body. At morning stops, they'd stretch even more actively. They'd climb out of the carriage, walk circles around the yard, swing their arms, jump in place. Local peasants were used to the sight of gentlemen and merchants hopping around the yard like madmen. They understood. It wasn't madness, but necessity. They did the same themselves after a long journey. The hardiest travelers managed to sleep even while standing. They'd lean their whole body against a corner of the carriage, spread their legs wide for stability, and doze in that position for 10 or 15 minutes. You couldn't call it proper sleep, but it gave the brain at least some respite. Soldiers at war slept the same way, wherever they could, in any position. A long winter journey was almost a military campaign, requiring the same endurance. For women, it was even harder. Their outfits, long dresses, corsets, multi-layered skirts, weren't designed for comfort in principle, and in a cramped carriage, they became true torture. So ladies would change into something simpler for long journeys, traveling dresses without corsets, with a minimum of petticoats. Propriety, of course, required them to put themselves back in order once they arrived, but on the road, survival was more important than etiquette. Children endured the journey more easily than adults. They could sleep anywhere and in any position. They'd be laid on the floor of the carriage, on soft items, covered with felt blankets, and would sleep through the whole night without stirring. True, one had to watch that nothing fell on the child during violent jolts, but overall, children were the least demanding passengers. Old people and the sick suffered most of all. They required more comfort, more warmth, more attention. Sometimes special hammocks were constructed for them in the carriage, fabric suspended between the walls to create something like a hanging bed. The jolting was felt less. Pressure on aching joints was reduced. True, you'd get quite motion sick in such a hammock, but for those who were truly unwell, this was the lesser of evils. And here's what's remarkable. People adapted to all of this. The first journey was a nightmare, the second slightly easier, the fifth already bearable. Those who traveled constantly, merchants, officials, couriers, could fall asleep in a carriage practically instantly, in any position, no matter how rough the ride. Their bodies had grown accustomed, had developed automatic responses. The body understood. If we're sitting in a carriage, it's time to sleep. Never mind what the conditions are around us. Friends, a small request. Support Lectures Under the Moon with a like. It helps the channel grow. This is the true art of sleeping in a winter carriage. Not fighting the discomfort, but accepting it and adapting. Our ancestors couldn't change the conditions, but they could change their attitude toward them. And they slept, and got their rest, and reached their destinations alive and more or less alert. And in the morning at the station, the long-awaited reward for all their nocturnal suffering awaited them. A real bed in a warm room. But that's another story. After endless jolting in a frozen carriage, after hours of sitting in an uncomfortable position with numb limbs, after battling cold and drowsiness, lights would appear ahead. A postal station. For the exhausted traveler, these lights meant roughly the same thing as an oasis to desert caravaneers. The chance to emerge from the icy prison of the carriage, stretch one's legs, warm up by the stove, and, oh miracle, lie down horizontally on something that at least remotely resembled a bed. But the joy was premature, because the station number 3, and what awaited the traveler beyond the door of the posting inn, could turn out to be either salvation or a new circle of roadside hell. Everything depended on luck, the thickness of one's wallet, and the ability to negotiate with the station master. Let's start with what a typical postal station in Russia during the 15th through 19th centuries actually was. It was a wooden hut or small wooden house along the highway where horses were changed and where travelers could rest. At the station lived the station master with his family. They kept stables with horses and hired coachmen. The distance between stations ranged from 20 to 40 versts, roughly 3 to 6 hours of travel in good conditions. You enter the station from the frost, and the first thing that hits you in the face is heat. The stove is stoked so hot you could roast a bear. For a frozen traveler, this was a shock to the system. The sharp temperature drop caused dizziness. Your face began to burn. Your fingers, which had been numb on the road, suddenly began to hurt as if they were being pricked with needles. Experienced people knew you had to enter a warm room gradually. First, stand in the entrance hall, let your body adjust. The main room of the station was usually a spacious chamber with long benches along the walls, a large table in the middle, and that same saving stove from which life-giving warmth emanated. Everyone gathered here, travelers, local coachmen, and the station master's family. It smelled of smoke, tar, wet sheepskin coats, sour cabbage, and cabbage soup. For someone who had spent 10 hours in a carriage, breathing only frosty air, this smell seemed almost cozy. But here's where the difficulties with accommodation began. There were usually no separate rooms at stations. More precisely, there were 1 or 2 better rooms, which were rented out for a separate fee to noble persons. Everyone else spent the night in the common hall, on those same benches along the walls. Imagine, you're exhausted, dreaming of peace and quiet, and around you are a dozen other travelers just like yourself. Someone is snoring, someone is coughing, someone is fussing with their belongings. Coachmen in the corner are playing cards and talking loudly. The benches were hard wood, without any bedding. Width about 40 centimeters, maybe 50. The length allowed you to stretch out full length, but turning from side to side was risky. You'd fall onto the floor. So people mainly slept on their backs, placing their own travel bag under their head or a rolled-up sheepskin coat, covering themselves with their own traveling blankets, which they had brought with them. Those who didn't get benches, and they ran out quickly, settled right on the floor. They spread hay or straw on the boards, which they requested from the station master for a separate fee. On top, they spread something from their own belongings and slept like that. The floor was cold. Despite the well-stoked stove, drafts blew from the boards. But at least you could stretch out without fear of falling. The most coveted spot was on the stove. The Russian stove was not only for cooking, but also for sleeping. Up on top, where the bricks held heat for hours, settled those lucky enough to negotiate with the station master, or who paid more. The temperature there was under 40 degrees, a real bathhouse. But after the icy carriage, it seemed like heavenly bliss. True, it was hard to breathe on the stove. The air was dry and hot. By morning, your mouth dried out so much that your tongue stuck to your palate. But these were trifles compared to the warmth. An interesting picture formed by night at the station. On the stove, 1 or 2 lucky ones, covered with their sheepskin coats. On the benches along the walls, better-dressed travelers who arrived earlier and took the spots. On the floor, those who were simpler or arrived late. In the corner behind a partition, if you were lucky, ladies, to whom they still allocated a separate nook for decency's sake. Somewhere a merchant snores. In another corner, coachmen tell tall tales in hushed voices. By the door, the station master counts the day's receipts. There was never silence. Someone was always arriving or departing. Horses were being led out, harnessed. Commands rang out in the yard, the jingling of harnesses, neighing. The door creaked, admitting new portions of cold air and new travelers. Falling asleep in such an environment was not easy, but after a sleepless night in the carriage, the body shut down from the mere possibility of lying horizontally. The food at stations was simple, but hot. Cabbage soup from sour cabbage with chunks of beef or pork, buckwheat porridge, millet or oat porridge with butter or lard, black bread, salted cucumbers, sauerkraut. For a frozen traveler, this food seemed like a feast. A bowl of steaming cabbage soup warmed from within better than any warming brick. Moreover, Abundant hot food helped the body restore the energy spent fighting the cold. An obligatory element of the station meal was tea. It was drunk from a samovar, which always stood on the table and bubbled, spreading a cozy smell. The tea was strong, hot, with sugar held in the teeth, or with honey. People drank several glasses in a row until they broke a sweat. That's what they said, drink tea until the seventh sweat. This was considered a sign that the body had completely warmed up and recovered from the road's cold. Spitten was also in use, a hot honey drink with spices. At good stations, it was prepared according to a special recipe, adding ginger, cinnamon, cloves, sometimes herbs. A glass of spitten after the road, and life regained meaning. Well, those who were poorer or simpler in manners ordered vodka. A shot glass or two for warmth was considered normal. The main thing was not to overdo it. But let's return to sleeping conditions, because food is good, warmth is wonderful, but in the end, everything came down to whether you'd managed to get enough sleep during those few hours allotted for rest. And here the lottery began. A prosperous station with a good station master could offer a separate room with a real bed, albeit with a hard mattress stuffed with straw. A poor station somewhere in the wilderness meant a cold hut, where even the stove was heated sparingly, and all the benches were occupied, and you had to sleep practically in the entrance hall on an armful of hay. Bed linens at stations were a conditional concept. At best, they gave you a coarse sheet and a feather pillow that smelled of the unwashed bodies of previous lodgers. The blanket was also of dubious cleanliness, so experienced travelers always brought their own traveling sheets and pillowcases. You spread out your own and sleep peacefully, not thinking about who lay here before you and what diseases they might have left behind. Bedbugs and fleas were permanent residents of any posting house. Wealthy stations at least tried to maintain cleanliness, regularly heating beds and treating benches with wormwood or tansy. Poor ones didn't stand on ceremony, what is. In the morning, travelers woke up bitten, scratched, and cursed, but there was nowhere to go. This was an inevitable element of roadside romance. Women had it especially hard, spending the night in a common hall where men snore, smoke pipes, and don't always watch their language. For a lady from decent society, this was an ordeal. Therefore, for women, they tried to allocate at least some separate corner, curtained off with a sheet or screen. There they could change clothes, tidy themselves up, and sleep without fear of immodest glances. Wealthy travelers sometimes rented the entire station, bought out all the spots, and the station became their personal apartments for the night. Other lodgers were simply not admitted, or they spent the night in the stable on hay. This cost considerable money, but guaranteed at least some semblance of privacy and comfort. Comparing sleep in the carriage and at the station, opinions differed. Some said, "Of course the station is better. It's warm, you can lie down, hot food." Others claimed the opposite. At the station it's noisy, bedbugs bite, the air is stale from the multitude of people. You sleep worse than in the carriage. The golden mean, as usual, was somewhere in the middle. The station gave the body necessary rest and the opportunity to recover, but the quality of sleep depended on many factors. There were legendary stations about which travelers spoke with delight, where the station master was hospitable, the food tasty, the beds clean, and there were even some conveniences like a separate little room for washing with a basin and pitcher. Such stations became desirable points on the route, and travelers tried to plan their overnight stays precisely there. But there were also cursed stations, where the keeper was a swindler, an extortionist demanding 3 times the price for every little thing, where you were fed slop, and you had to sleep literally on the bare floor in a freezing room. Travelers warned each other about such stations, recording them in diaries with detailed curses addressed to the keeper and his entire family. An interesting point was the social hierarchy at the station. An official with papers from the governor automatically received the best spot. A wealthy merchant could buy himself comfort. A poor townsman made do with what was left. A peasant might not get inside at all, spending the night in the barn with the horses. This was Russia of that time in miniature, with all its class hierarchy and inequality. Morning at the station began early. Around 5 or 6 o'clock, everyone was already being roused. "Who's traveling onward? Get yourselves together, the horses are ready." They washed with icy water from a tub in the yard. It refreshed after the stifling night. They grabbed a quick breakfast, the same porridge, leftover cabbage soup, tea. They settled accounts with the keeper, who recorded everything in a thick ledger. For lodging, for food, for oats for the horses, for every trifle. And back into the carriage. Back to the cold, the jolting, the endless road. But after several hours at the station, after hot food and relative rest, strength returned. The body had gotten a respite, and it was possible to travel onward to the next station, to the next round of road trials. The paradox was that over time, travelers began to see charm even in wretched stations. After a week on the road, any opportunity to lie on something solid and motionless seemed like luxury. A hard bench was, after all, not a shaking carriage seat. A neighbor's snoring was not the howling wind outside the window. Bedbugs were trifles compared to the risk of frostbite. Everything is relative. And the road changed one's value system in the most radical way. There were travelers who preferred not to stop at stations for long at all. They changed horses, grabbed hot tea, something edible, and onward. They slept in the carriage, saving time. Such a strategy allowed reaching one's destination faster, but required iron health and character. Most people still alternated. A night in the carriage, a night at the station. Again, this way the body got at least some variety and opportunity to recover. And you know, there's something symbolic about these stations. They were islands of civilization in the icy desert of winter roads, a place where people of different classes and fates gathered together, united by the common goal of surviving the journey, where they shared stories, advice, complained about the hardships of the road. These few hours at the station created a special brotherhood, temporary but genuine. And in the morning, everything began anew. The carriage, the cold, the jolting, the struggle for warmth and sleep. But now you knew that ahead there would be stations. There would be hot tea, and the chance, if only briefly, to feel like a human being, and not an icy statue on wheels. And that was enough to keep traveling onward toward one's goal, no matter what. About those who undertook the most incredible winter journeys, about legendary routes and amazing stories, we'll talk further. Now that we know everything about the design of carriages, methods of warming, and station lodgings, it's time to talk about those who truly became famous for their winter travels. About people whose names remained in history, along with tales of their epic trips along the icy highways of Russia and Europe. Because it's one thing to know the theory, and quite another to hear the stories of those who went through it in practice. Let's begin at the very top of the social pyramid, with imperial journeys. When the Tsar or Empress set out on the road in winter, it turned into a real expedition. Catherine II, for instance, made several famous winter trips, and her traveling coaches were the pinnacle of luxury of that time. The Empress's carriage was a true palace on runners. Double walls stuffed with swan down, interior upholstery of sable, special braziers under the floor for heating. But the most interesting thing was how the Empress slept on the road. Her dormouse carriage was equipped with a folding bed with a real mattress brought from the palace. Sheets of the finest Dutch linen were changed at every station, down pillows in silk pillowcases. Above the bed hung a canopy of velvet, which created additional insulation and retained heat. She slept under a sable blanket worth several years' budgets of a small province. Catherine kept a travel diary, and there are interesting entries in it. In one of her trips in the year 1768, she wrote, "The frost was such that the ink froze in the inkwell, though the carriage is heated quite well. I had to write in pencil." There's your imperial luxury. Even with braziers and furs, the cold crept inside. True, she also noted that she slept splendidly, as at home, which speaks to the effectiveness of all these measures. Catherine did not travel alone. Behind her carriage followed an entire procession. Dozens of coaches with courtiers, servants, guards, wagons with belongings, provisions, even traveling furniture. At each station, apartments prepared in advance awaited the Empress. Rooms were warmed, beds made with fresh linens, tables set for a meal. Station keepers prepared for her arrival for weeks, understanding that the slightest mistake could cost them their career. A completely different story were the couriers. These people were true heroes of the road. An imperial courier could gallop from Petersburg to Moscow in 3 days, stopping only to change horses. They slept right in the sleighs, or kibitkas, wrapped in sheepskin coats for 15 to 20 minutes between stations. Not sleeping, dozing in snatches, because they had to control the coachman and watch the road. One such courier, Ivan Kalashnikov, left memoirs about a trip in the winter of 1812, in the midst of the war with Napoleon. He was carrying urgent dispatches from Moscow to Petersburg. He rode for 4 days without stops except to change horses. He slept sitting up, pressing the leather case with documents to his chest. On the 3rd night, from exhaustion, hallucinations began. It seemed that French soldiers were running along the roadsides. He made it, delivered the dispatches, and slept for 20 hours straight without even undressing. The famous poet Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin also left many accounts of winter travels. In the year 1829, he rode from Moscow to the Caucasus in winter to meet with the army. The journey took about 3 weeks. In letters to friends, he complained, "I froze like a dog, slept sitting up, with a suitcase of manuscripts under my head. I was afraid the ink would freeze and I wouldn't be able to write." Pushkin traveled without particular luxury. An ordinary traveling kibitka, a sheepskin coat, a foot warmer. But he was free to make stops where he wanted, to spend nights at stations when he got tired. An interesting incident is described in his diary. He stopped at a certain station, lay down to sleep on a bench. At night, he woke from someone pulling his sheepskin coat off him. It turned out another traveler, freezing on the floor, had decided to borrow part of the warmth. Pushkin didn't make a scene, simply suggested lying next to him and covering themselves together. And so they slept until morning, under one sheepskin coat, the poet and an unknown merchant. In the morning, they parted without even introducing themselves to each other. The road erased formalities. Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin, historian and writer, made a famous journey through Russia at the end of the 18th century, partly in winter. His notes are full of everyday details. Here he describes a night's lodging at a shabby station somewhere near Tver. The bench is hard as stone. The straw mattress stinks of mildew. But after 2 nights in a carriage, this seems like feather beds from the gardens of paradise. I fell asleep instantly and slept without dreams, like the dead. Karamzin described in detail the technique of sleeping in a carriage. He advised wearing a special traveling cap, a fur hat with long ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. The head must be kept warm, otherwise a cold is inevitable. He also recommended drinking hot milk with honey before sleep. It induces sleep and warms from within. The Marquis de Custine, a French traveler who visited Russia in the year 1839, was shocked by the winter travel conditions. In his famous notes, he wrote, "Russians sleep in carriages like bears in dens, motionless, wrapped in furs." I tried to read on the road, but my fingers grew so numb from the cold that I couldn't hold a book. I tried to sleep, but every bump jolted me awake. 3 weeks of travel from Petersburg to Moscow felt like years to me. De Custine described his first night at a Russian postal station as a culture shock. A common room where people of different estates slept on benches, the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco, snoring that, according to him, could be heard in the neighboring province. He asked for a separate room, paid 3 times the usual rate, and received a closet-sized cubbyhole where a narrow bed barely fit. But it was my cubbyhole, and I slept there more happily than I would have in Versailles. Dramatic stories happened as well. In 1823, Count Stroganov was traveling in winter from his estate to Petersburg. He was caught in a blizzard. The carriage lost its way. They wandered all night. The horses were exhausted. By morning, it turned out that the coachman had frostbitten both hands. The Count had to drive the horses himself, though he had never held reins before. They reached the nearest village by a miracle. The coachman suffered greatly, but survived. Another story concerns Princess Volkonskaya, wife of a Decembrist, who in the winter of 1826 traveled to Siberia to join her husband. She was 20 years old and had never undertaken long journeys before. The road took 3 months. 3 months of winter, cold, nights at stations and in peasant huts. In her memoirs, there are piercing lines. "I slept wherever I could, on benches, on the stove, in a sleigh under the open sky when no shelter was found. I wept from exhaustion and cold, but rode on, because love is stronger than any frost." Curious incidents also occurred. Count Zawodowski, known for his eccentricities, traveled in winter with his beloved dog, a huge hound named Baron. The dog slept in the carriage with his master, serving as a living warmer. At the stations, the station masters were frightened when first a dog the size of a calf emerged from the carriage, and only then the Count himself. Zawodowski claimed that sleeping with Baron was warmer than under any furs. Perhaps he was right. The merchant Baranov, who traded in furs, developed his own system for winter travel. He carried with him a portable bathhouse, a special box with a brazier that was set up at stations. While the horses were being changed, Baranov managed to take a steam bath and claimed that afterward he could ride for another day without stopping. Other merchants adopted his practice, and at some stations they began building small bathhouses, especially for travelers. The priest, Avrami, traveling in the winter of 1840 to his new place of service, described his experience in a letter to the bishop. "I traveled for 7 days, slept in God's temple right on the floor, for the local priest would not let me into his house. I slept in the carriage, in huts, once even in a barn with animals who warmed me with their heat. The Lord is merciful and brought me alive and well." Students and young people traveling to study or take up positions often journeyed in groups, pooling their resources, renting one covered wagon for 4 or 5, economizing on everything, sleeping head to foot, covering themselves with shared furs. There was no money for station lodgings. They spent the night right in the wagon in the station yard. Youth allowed them to endure such conditions without special suffering. But what friendships were born in these shared journeys? Many later remembered their student winter trips as the best time of their lives. Actors and musicians touring the provinces with performances lived on the road for months at a time. They had their own folklore, their own songs about the trials of travel. The famous actress Semyonova recalled, "Over the winter we traveled thousands of versts, slept anywhere, ate whatever we could get, but went on stage and performed, forgetting our fatigue. The theater demands sacrifices, and the Winter Road is one of them. Perhaps the most impressive story is the journey of Dr. Haas, the famous Moscow physician and philanthropist. In winter, he traveled to Siberia with convicts, bringing medicine and warm clothing. He was already past 60. The road took 4 months. He slept in carriages, at stations, in peasant huts, never once complaining. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "Every uncomfortable night on the road is a reminder of how those I am going to help live. They sleep on bunks in cold barracks. My carriage is luxury compared to their conditions." These stories show one thing. Winter journeys were an ordeal endured by people of the most varied fates and characters. Empresses in luxurious sleeping carriages and peasants in simple sleighs, poets and merchants, priests and convicts. All of them learned firsthand what it meant to sleep in the frost, in motion, far from home. And each found their own ways to endure it, to adapt, and sometimes even to find some truth of their own in it. But every journey has a dark side, dangers that lay in wait on winter roads. And we shall speak of them in the next, concluding part. We have spoken much about the romance of the road, about the comfort of stations, about the tricks of survival. But the time has come to speak of the serious side. Winter travel by carriage was a true ordeal, not merely uncomfortable or tiring. It required knowledge, preparation, and constant vigilance. The road did not forgive recklessness, and every journey was a test of character. The main danger was fatigue, which crept up unnoticed. After several sleepless nights, after constant struggle against the cold, the body began to demand rest. Eyelids grew heavy, thoughts became confused, and a moment arrived when one wanted only one thing: to lose oneself, to fall asleep, to stop fighting. It was precisely at this moment that special caution was required. Doctors of that time knew well the risks of hypothermia. When body temperature drops, the organism enters a state resembling deep sleep. Breathing becomes rare. A person may appear peacefully asleep, though they require urgent help. That is why it was so important to notice the signs of hypothermia in time. To rub the person down, give them a hot drink, warm them up. Church records from that time preserved many mentions of travelers who suffered on the road. Especially harsh were the winters of 1812, when frosts reached 40 degrees below zero, and 20, when blizzards were so strong that roads were completely snowed over. Frostbite was a common occurrence. People lost sensation in their fingers and toes, suffered from the consequences. The merchant Serebrennikov, in his notes, mentions an incident when his traveling companion did not notice in time that his extremities had lost sensation, and then recovered for a long time afterward. It was a harsh lesson about the importance of constant monitoring of one's condition. Especially vulnerable were women. Their clothing, corsets, thin stockings, delicate shoes, were created for balls, not for winter roads. There is a well-known case of a young noblewoman who was traveling to her fiancé and for the sake of beauty wore fashionable boots instead of warm felt boots. The consequences were serious. The wedding had to be postponed for several months. Medical knowledge of that time was contradictory. On one hand, doctors correctly advised multi-layered clothing, hot drinks, active movements for warming up. On the other hand, dangerous misconceptions existed. For example, it was believed that alcohol warmed one well. In reality, spirits created only an illusion of warmth, dilating blood vessels and causing the body to lose heat faster. Another misconception concerned sleep. Many thought that a sleeping person was less cold. Reality was different. A sleeping person does not control body temperature. does not move, cannot notice a problem in time. Therefore, experienced travelers always traveled in groups, supporting one another. One watched over another during sleep, did not allow them to sink too deeply into oblivion, checked the condition of hands and feet. After an hour, or an hour and a half, they switched. This system of mutual support helped many complete their journey safely. Solitary travelers risked far more. Blizzards created separate difficulties. When a snowstorm began, visibility dropped to 0. The coachman lost his bearings. The carriage could stray from the path. To be caught in a blizzard meant waiting until the bad weather subsided or help arrived. This could be long hours or even a full day without the ability to move. The priest Ivan Beryukov described an incident from 1837. Their carriage was caught in a severe blizzard between Tver and Moscow. They stood nearly 2 full days sheltering in the carriage. Fortunately, they were discovered by soldiers passing by. Everyone survived, though the ordeal was severe. Wild animals also posed a problem. During a hungry winter, wolves could approach carriages. Usually they didn't dare attack if people made noise and showed their activity. Travelers carried torches and weapons for protection. But the most insidious danger was carelessness. "Oh well, the warming brick cooled down. I'll make it." Like that. "Oh well, my feet are numb. I'll warm up at the station." "Oh well, I'm sleepy. I'll nap a little." This recklessness created problems. Every small detail mattered. Every safety rule was important. Those who survived difficult journeys safely learned a valuable lesson. They understood that comfort isn't luxury. It's safety. A warm home isn't just pleasant. It's an essential need. The ability to sleep in warmth without fear is a great blessing worth cherishing. Winter carriage travel was a school of endurance and wisdom. It taught that humans depend on natural conditions more than it seems, that no luxury can replace proper preparation, that life is precious and requires care for oneself. Princess Volkonskaya, who undertook a difficult journey to Siberia one year, wrote in her memoirs, "The road taught me to value every minute of warmth, every sip of hot tea, every opportunity to rest. What seemed ordinary became a priceless gift." Only a century and a half or two have passed. We invented trains with heated carriages, automobiles with climate control, airplanes that cover in hours distances that required weeks of travel. We forgot what it's like to worry about warmth on the road, to plan every stage of a journey with weather in mind. But it's worth remembering those times, and everything becomes clearer. Every warm night in one's own bed is the result of centuries of progress. The ability to travel in comfort is an achievement that our ancestors could only imagine in dreams. A safe road, where the main concern isn't survival but entertainment, is a gift of modernity. Winter carriages have passed into history. Post stations became museums. No one carries heated bricks for warmth. But the memory of these times is important. It reminds us what our ancestors went through, how much ingenuity and fortitude was required for an ordinary trip from one city to another. They weren't heroes from legends. These were ordinary people of their time. Merchants transported goods, officials traveled on business, families visited relatives. They did what was required, adapted to conditions, found solutions. Their experience is an example of resourcefulness and perseverance. Next time you find yourself in a warm bed, under a soft blanket, in a room with heating, remember those travelers. Remember their readiness to overcome difficulties, their ability to value simple joys. Hot tea at a station, a warm stove, the opportunity to stretch numb legs. And cherish what we have now: warmth, comfort, safety, the ability to sleep peacefully in any weather. All this is the result of a long journey, from icy carriages to modern cozy homes. A journey that many generations traveled, leaving us as inheritance not only technologies, but also wisdom. The history of winter travel teaches us gratitude. Gratitude for warmth, for safety, for opportunities that seem natural. Our ancestors dreamed of what has become ordinary for us, and in this lies the main lesson of their experience. Good night to you, in warmth, in comfort, in safety. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. After all, you live in times when this has become the norm. Times when a warm bed is available to everyone, and isn't an unattainable dream of a weary traveler. Remember history, cherish the present, and pass this knowledge forward, so that future generations also understand how long humanity's path to comfort was, and at what price it was achieved. With you was Daniel Hayes. See you in the next episode of Lectures Under the Moon. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you enjoyed this journey into the past.